It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. How are you today, David?
Excited about today's show, of course.
And we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
And I'm excited about today's show, too. Last week, we had Dr. George Luber on the show. He was being honored with the Joe A. Calloway Award for Civic Courage for blowing the whistle at the Centers for Disease Control when he was ordered to tamp down his efforts to deal with the climate crisis. Well, on the show today, we're going to feature another courageous Joe A. Calloway Award winner. His name is John M. Barnett. Regular listeners to this show know the many different ways we have covered the Boeing MAX 8 story. We've talked about how mergers and management decisions have turned a once great engineering company to more of a financial company intent on jacking up its stock price, not through innovation, but through buying back its own stock. We've talked about how the Federal Aviation Commission dropped the ball and allowed Boeing to essentially regulate itself. And we've talked about how the marketeers at Boeing have continually overruled the engineers. Mr. Barnett was a quality control expert at Boeing, working not on the MAX 8, but on the 787 Dreamliner at their big production facility in South Carolina. There, he blew the whistle on shoddy engineering and a corporate culture where profits trump safety. He's got an eye-opening story to tell, and we look forward to hearing that. As always, we will take a moment after that to find out what's happening in the other dark recesses of the corporate underworld with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. And Ralph will also answer some listener questions. But first, let's meet yet another courageous whistleblower. David?
John M. Barnett was a quality control manager at Boeing for 25 years in its Seattle facility. He transferred in 2011 to manage Boeing's new plant in South Carolina to build the 787 Dreamliner, where he revealed shoddy production, as reported on the front page of the April 20th, 2019 New York Times. He retired under pressure in 2017 and assumed the challenge to inform the flying public. His whistleblower complaint to OSHA is now pending. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, John Barnett.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Indeed. Welcome, John Barnett. Describe the plane that you have been very concerned about, the Dreamliner, and how many of them are up in the air? When was the first one launched?
Okay, it's a 787, and the biggest concern came when they opened the Charleston plant. That's when the issues and the shoddy production work really started. And I believe our first delivery out of there was 2012.
And why did they open a plant in North Charleston, South Carolina, where there was a dearth of skilled workers, instead of expanding their facility in Seattle, where I understand the Dreamliner is also produced, in your judgment, as a much higher standard than at South Carolina? What brought them to South Carolina?
Well, I can tell you, Ralph, what the information was shared with us from Boeing was is they were trying to expand the production facilities and bring other areas into the mix. But from an internal standpoint, it was more about the union activity that was up in Washington State, and there were the battles with them and the strikes that they were causing. So they were really wanting to get to a non-unionized right-to-work state.
Did the governor of South Carolina help them do that? Nikki Haley is now on the board of the Boeing Corporation for a few meetings, earning, as other board members are, over $300,000 a year. What was, beside being a non-union state, they give them all kinds of subsidies?
Yes, sir. The information we were provided inside of Boeing as employees were that there were hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies and tax breaks and that type of thing that Boeing was offered to go to South Carolina. And part of that deal was that we hired most of the employees locally. So we were not allowed to go to areas that had high experience in aerospace and airplane building. We had to hire the local people fresh out of college.
And I remember Boeing was saying that they were going to have training facilities, so to upgrade untrained workers to the very demanding tasks of assembling an aircraft. This was really not a manufacturing facility as it was an assembling one. Isn't that right? Bringing various parts from around the country and the world?
Yes, sir, that's correct. The 787 is fabricated from various parts of the world, and they all come together, and final assembly is performed in Charleston and Everett. Yes, sir.
You were a quality control inspector who received high commendations when you worked at the Seattle plant.
Yes, sir.
You volunteered to go to South Carolina. You've once said that the quality control inspectors at Boeing are the last check, the last safety check before the plane takes off with passengers.
That's correct. The quality control or quality personnel are last line of defense. That's correct.
Given the importance of this skill, why is it that Boeing is laying off literally hundreds of quality control people in both their Seattle plant and South Carolina? What's their reason for that?
Well, so they've been preaching for years that quality is non-value added, doesn't bring any value to the product. So they've been trying real hard to eliminate quality. And in the process of eliminating quality, what they're doing internally is they're telling inspectors not to document defects. They're telling quality folks, to do a visual buy-off and not document things, and just way outside the realms of how they should be building an airplane.
John, when you use the word quality, I think it's almost a term of art. You don't mean metallurgical quality or something. You're talking about quality control inspectors, aren't you?
Yes, sir, that's correct. And yeah, so within Boeing, you have what you call the quality department, and you have manufacturing. And within the quality department, that's where your inspectors are, your quality managers, your quality assurance investigators. Anything having to do with quality of the product is under the quality organization.
So why would they want to eliminate that critical role? Because they know if a plane goes down because of Boeing's neglect or negligence, it can be all hell for Boeing to pay. Look what happened after the 2 MAX crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia, and on other crashes in the past. I mean, how can they dare take a risk like that? Who's going to replace several hundred Boeing quality control inspectors in Seattle and in South Carolina?
So what their plan is, what they call an MFPP, it's a multifunction process or production process. And basically what it allows it to do is it's a mechanic to buy off his buddy's work. So mechanics are buying off each other's work, saying that it's good to go.
We're talking with John Barnett, former quality control inspector for the Boeing Corporation on the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. John, aren't they also arguing that automation is better, more reliable than human quality control inspectors? I heard that reported in the press.
Yes, that is correct. However, there's very limited on what can actually be implemented within the aircraft program. We've had several what I'd call false starts with the technology where there's, they're promising that it's bigger, better, and badder than any inspector. Well, they go to implement it, and it isn't. So there's a lot of trial and error, and there's a lot of discussion before they've actually implemented things and proven them out.
Well, your experience, which we'll get to in a moment, the shoddy situation going on in the North Charleston plant in South Carolina, was so detailed that you were a main source for the New York Times Sunday page 1 expose of what was going on down there with the Dreamliner and the sloppiness, carelessness in the Charleston, North Carolina plant. So would you run us through how it all started? I mean, you were one of numerous quality control inspectors, and some of them have followed your courage after you took the first step. But what is it about the other quality control inspectors when they see the same things you see, but they don't protest, they don't write it up?
Well, and that goes back to the inexperience of the workforce. The people that's been hired in Charleston are brand new to Boeing. So they're basically doing what they're told. They're not experienced and knowledgeable enough to know when to push back and when it's not right. They're just doing what's told and following direction. And the management there is just laying pressure on them big time to get the planes out the door, regardless of the condition, just to get them delivered and make the cash register ring.
What fascinated me when I read the New York Times article is the sloppiness on a plane that sells for how much? How much does one Dreamliner sell for?
Well, they're listed for 150 million. They actually sell for about 150 million.
150 million?
Yes, sir.
And they're leaving all kinds of junk on the plane after they've finished assembling it. Why don't you describe how you started seeing things you couldn't believe compared to the higher standards you left in the Seattle Dreamliner plant?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Why don't you give us that narrative?
Okay, so just a real quick background. It's been 25 years in Everett, Washington, working on 747, 777, 787 when it first started up there. And the culture in Everett and actually Washington State, you got to think back. There's several generations of employees that have been building airplanes. So you have the generational knowledge transfer of how to build airplanes. And the culture up there and the general population understands the criticality of following processes and procedures and making sure the airplane's built correctly. Whereas you do not have that in Charleston. They don't understand the ramifications of what a defect could cause because they don't have that experience. And what we found in Charleston, or what I've noticed in Charleston, is there's a lot more pressure on mechanics to just buy off their jobs and get them sold. I mean, they're measured almost by the hour, and they're measured by how many, we call them beans, a job when they go to complete a job and get inspected by an inspector and bought off, we call that a bean. So they're all about bean counts, how many jobs they can get done in a day, not necessarily that it's done correctly. And the pressure from management is just get the airplanes out. And another part of the Charleston culture that I've noticed is that the leadership here seems to be more interested in self-promotions instead of making sure the product is built correctly, if that makes sense. So it's more focused on themselves and how a decision might affect their career versus how it's going to affect the airplane. You know what I'm saying?
Right. So what did you start to discover?
I think they're really making some poor decisions. And when I first moved down to Charleston, I was the first quality manager hired to set up Charleston plant. And we had developed training plans and from the quality perspective of how to look up procedures, how to follow drawings, how to do your job. And we were pretty much shut down. None of the mechanics went through our training. Very few of our inspectors had to go through it. Manufacturing had set up a training program for their mechanics, and it was mandatory for our inspectors to go through their training. So I sent my inspectors through it, and they came back and said the only thing they're teaching them is how to roller stamp paperwork. They're not teaching them how to build an airplane. They're not teaching them how to follow processes, just how to close out jobs. So that's kind of where it started, was right when Charleston first opened up. And just over the years, it just got worse and worse as far as bypassing procedures, not documenting defects, not maintaining configuration control of the airplane. And towards the end of my time at Boeing, the issues that I discovered was we had hundreds of defective parts. And what a defective part is something that does not meet engineering or quality requirements and should not be used on an airplane. So we had hundreds upon hundreds of missing non-conforming parts that they didn't know where they went. So I wanted to make sure that we track these parts down, trace them down, figure out where they went, and if they've been installed on airplanes, we need to get them corrected. My management shut me down. They basically what we call pencil whip. So when you have a job that you have to perform at Boeing, it's a work order, and it's got steps. And each step has a specific instruction of what you need to do or how you need to install a part in the airplane. Well, rather than mechanics actually installing the parts and inspectors verifying it, they just sit at their desk and roller stamp things. And we find parts all over the place that the paperwork says it's been installed, but the part's sitting over on the shelf.
Good heavens. I can see passengers listening to this and saying, yuck, what is going on here? This is a $150 million plane, and they're engaged in sloppy pencil whipping, as you say. We're talking with John M. Barnett, who is described by the Callaway Award for Civic Courage as, quote, a defiant trustee for airline passenger and crew safety, as veteran quality control manager for the Boeing Corporation on the Boeing 747, 767, 777, and 787 programs. And you have been quoted as saying, quote, "I haven't seen a plane out of Charleston yet that I put my name on saying it's safe and airworthy," end quote. Well, have any of these planes crashed due to the sloppiness and the misplaced parts at the Charleston plant?
No, sir, they have not as of yet. But let me throw in a caveat that in production and aircraft production and working with Boeing all these years, we have a rule of thumb that it takes 8 to 10 years for a defect to become an issue on an airplane. So, if you look at the 8 to 10 year time frame before a defect becomes an issue, and our first plane was delivered in 2012, we're starting to get into that 8 to 10 year window. So you're correct. We have not lost any 787s to date, and thank God, and I hope that continues. I'm just really concerned that the way they were produced and delivered, that is not going to be the case in the future.
Well, when Boeing's managers and higher ups saw your write-ups, your documented write-ups on misplaced parts, missing parts, parts in the wrong place, shavings here and there, did they move to correct it? And what are they doing if these planes are already up in the air? Are they thinking about sending bulletins to the airlines? Apart from what they did to you, which we'll get to, what are they
Right.
doing for that? I mean, who's in charge here? Doesn't all this come down from top management?
Yes, sir, it does. It comes from the top down. But in Charleston, you're right, that it's more about profits over safety and quality. And like I say, they're really putting the pressure on the mechanics just to close things out and quality not document defects. And it's an ongoing thing. And you hear about the titanium slivers that's all in the flight control wires and the electronic equipment and that type of thing. That's a major issue. And when I brought it up, I insisted that the airplanes be cleaned. And I told my boss flat out, I refuse to buy off on this airplane as is. I was transferred to a different location. He brought in another way less inexperienced quality manager than myself, and the leadership there decided that they weren't going to take the time to clean the airplanes. They're going to deliver them. And they've delivered. I filed my complaint in January of 2017 with the FAA. Since then, the FAA has gone in and did a spot check, and they inspected 5 airplanes in Charleston, and they found these metal shavings on all 10 airplanes, both locations. And what they did was they issued a DAI, a designated airworthiness inspection requirement to Boeing. And what that DAI does is within the internal workings of Boeing, it tells them that they have to clean these planes before they can deliver them. But where they came up short, and I don't know if you caught it on the response that they did to the New York Times story, that the FAA came back and said Boeing decided that those slivers weren't a safety of flight issue. And I don't understand how electronic equipment full of slivers, metal titanium slivers, all over the flight control wires, the electronic equipment, the power panels that actually run the full power of the airplane. I don't see how that cannot be a safety of flight issue with metal shavings in there.
Well, tell us how many of these Dreamliners are up and what routes do they usually fly?
So I'm not sure what the count is up to now. I know when I left, we were up over 800 airplanes that had already been delivered. And they typically fly overseas, so they fly over the oceans and the long routes to other countries.
And how many pilots?
2, I believe. I believe it takes 2 to fly the 787.
And were there any counterfeit parts, which are not Boeing's fault? They don't counterfeit parts, but there are reports over the years of counterfeit parts, for example, coming from East Asia, very, very facsimile similar. Were there any counterfeit parts that you discovered?
So actually, I was part of that back before when all this came up. I was actually working receiving inspection at the time when all the counterfeit part issue came up. And we put very specific safety catches in place to make sure that incoming parts were not counterfeit. Again, in Charleston, they've eliminated those. So we don't know for sure if there's counterfeit parts coming in or not, to be honest with you. They've bypassed those safety or those quality checkpoints.
Why weren't there FAA inspectors at the scene? This plant has 7,000 employees in North Charleston, South Carolina.
Right.
I mean, why was it just left up to you and others to make these discoveries? I think people think the FAA is the watchdog here.
Well, and that's another issue that really needs to be addressed, Ralph, because, like I say, I've been working for Boeing for 32 years, and over the years, I've seen the FAA backing off on their oversight, and they've become more of a partnership than an oversight. And the FAA representatives there at Charleston, I actually worked real close with them. They were afraid of Boeing to find too many issues because they would be transferred or kicked out of the Charleston plant. So there was a very intimidation factor from Boeing to the FAA representatives at Charleston. They were
So,
afraid to make too many waves.
like federal poultry and meat inspectors, that's the same problem they've had when they try to be conscientious and do their job for the consumer. I want to ask you, when these charges come out from you, and after you set the standard of speaking out, I understand that there were other whistleblowing safety complaints filed with federal regulators by Boeing workers. Does Boeing ever feel obliged to respond to these publicly?
Well, so Ralph, their response is spun. I mean, they have what they call spin doctors. They'll spin it to, we call it the Boeing switch. So if an employee raises a concern, saying, as an example, if I raised a concern saying that people aren't buying off their job or are not documenting defects, well, then Boeing turns it around and accuses me of not documenting defects. So the person that's complaining, they turn it around and point at them and say they're the ones doing it wrong. So that's a big problem. So no, they're not willing to have a face-to-face discussion and discuss it. It's just try to cover up, make it go away, and make the whistleblowers look bad.
John, do you ever find engineering professors who don't have to worry about Boeing paying them a salary supporting you? Do you ever find anybody outside Boeing in the engineering and inspection profession taking a stand on your behalf?
Not personally, other than my legal counsel, which is excellent, but not really. I know that after the New York Times came out, I think it was CNN had some specialists on there, and they supported what I was saying, that the metal slivers could be catastrophic. And we haven't gotten into the oxygen systems, where the emergency oxygen for passengers in a decompression event. I discovered that 25% of them do not work on the 787s.
Why don't you repeat that? Because people are told all the time, when the oxygen drops, put it on, every time you take a flight.
Put it on, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So what you're saying is a quarter of them didn't work?
That's correct. Yes, sir. A team and myself put together a control sample of over 300 of them, and out of those, 75 of them did not operate as required. They did not release the oxygen. I elevated this to my management. Again, I was removed from the investigation. They turned it over to I think it was a 2-year employee within Boeing, and they didn't do anything with it.
What'd they do with the 800 Dreamliners that have these oxygen units?
They have done nothing to correct it. They've done nothing to identify a root cause. They have done nothing to correct the issue, Ralph.
And no airworthiness directive from the FAA, and no Boeing warning bulletin to their customers, the airlines?
That's correct. Yes.
Now, tell us if you think there's an increasing danger in air safety from over-automation, from automating your type of job all the way to the kind of automation that increase the likelihood that those Boeing Maxes would crash, the so-called software fix that took control of the plane away from the pilots. Some specialist I talked to called it the silent hijacker, and pushed the planes down with 340 human beings into the Java Sea and an Ethiopian farm area. Give us your take on this drive for automation, which is, of course, to cut costs and increase Boeing's bottom line, even though, and this was not brought out by the congressional hearing, John, Boeing has spent over $40 billion with a B dollars on stock buybacks to raise its stock, to increase the stock options of the compensation of Boeing's bosses. And as people are getting to know, stock buybacks don't create a single job. They don't build a single product. They're just there to increase the metrics for executive compensation. So here's
Exactly right.
Boeing. Here's Boeing cutting corners that affect the lives of people in the future in these planes, and they're in effect burning tens of billions of dollars in stock buybacks.
Yes, sir. That's inconceivable to me. I can't wrap my head around it because Boeing's number one priority should be the safety of the flying public. And the last 6 years that I worked with them, that is the last thing on their mind is the safety of the flying public because it's just about kicking airplanes out and making the cash register ring.
Well, they claim they've had a great safety record, and automation will make it safety plus. Your response?
So going back to my comment earlier, the rule of thumb in aircraft production is it takes 8 to 10 years for a defect to manifest into an issue. So if you look at the last 20 years, that safety record that Boeing is touting right now is built on the past quality of 747, 767, 777s. So the 787 has not been in service long enough to meet the quality level or to prove that they're at the quality level that the other programs are at. So that's what Boeing is saying, that they're at the highest quality level or they've had an excellent safety record. But again, we're just now getting into that 8 to 10 year window. So
you're pointing out something that needs elaboration. A lot of people have said that after the McDonnell Douglas merger with Boeing, where the McDonnell Douglas culture took over Boeing, Boeing moved from a prime engineering high reputation firm to a financial get the stock up, stock option bonus firm, and degraded its engineering priorities. In fact, someone said about the MAX that the Boeing marketeers overruled the Boeing engineers. In your career, did you see that change firsthand?
yes, sir, I did. Unfortunately, it was probably about 6 months or 9 months after the merger between Boeing and McDonnell Douglas. And we, within Boeing on the production floor, had a little, I guess you'd call it a little funny or a little joke that said, Boeing didn't buy McDonnell Douglas. McDonnell Douglas bought Boeing with its own money. And what I saw was when the merger happened, they brought in the McDonnell Douglas leadership to take over the Boeing company. And it was like a light switch. It went from quality to all about shareholder value. It was just amazing. Looking back, it just is so clear that the direction of the company made a 180 turn at that point in time.
Well, how, as we conclude, I want to get Steve and David in on this, but how are you holding up professionally and personally? I mean, they forced you into retirement.
Yes, sir, they did. I'm not gonna lie. It's been rough on me. It's been rough on my family. I'm still dealing with issues. I'm still having anxiety attacks, PTSD, but it's been very rough. It's taken a serious mental and emotional toll on me. But, I want to try very hard to keep the focus on the safety of the airplane. That's what my story is about, is telling my story enough to where the right people get involved to make sure that these airplanes are made correctly. Because the 787 carries 288 passengers plus crew. So the last thing I want to do is wake up in the morning and see a 787 that's gone down because, titanium slivers caught fire at 40,000 feet, or a defective part broke loose because it wasn't built correctly, or, they had a decompression event and people weren't able to get emergency oxygen. I mean, it keeps me up at night, Ralph. I can't sleep. It's taken a heck of a toll on me.
And for this level of professional concern, you got Boeing's trying to break you, discredit
Yes,
you,
sir.
defame you, and probably
Yes, sir.
blackball you from any future employment opportunities should you seek them.
Yes, sir. Actually, that's already happened. I've been blocked. I was blacklisted. I was blocked from 2 different positions that I'm aware of that I can prove. There was probably others that I can't prove. And that's another thing, when you're dealing with Boeing, you have to have it in documentation, because otherwise it's your word against theirs and they're going to win every time. But I was able to keep my documentation.
I noticed that at the congressional hearings in the past few days, the Boeing CEO, Mullenberger, was a very contrite and humble, and he paid compassionate attention to the families, holding up the pictures of their deceased relatives. But he knew, and the Boeing lobbyists behind him and the chairs knew, that they own the Congress. They give money to over 300 members of Congress. They're saying
Yes,
to
sir.
Congress, where else is anybody going to go? We're Boeing and Airbus, and you're not going to go after the only domestic manufacturer of big body passenger jets. And it's really sickening to watch because the questions coming in are tough within a narrow framework. They don't go into the fundamental design, although Congressman Steve Cohen from Tennessee laid out how much Muhlenberg was being paid and asked him why he didn't get a pay cut. He was being paid $30 million even after the crashes, and he didn't ask for a pay cut. And he replied to Congressman Cohen, well, it's up to the board of directors. Well, he was chairman of the board of directors. I calculated in the 3 hours I was sitting there listening to him, he made $45,000.
Wow.
Just in those 3 hours.
Unbelievable.
So we're dealing with corporate emperors who put on a show for the members of Congress, and they're humble, and they always address them as congressmen and congresswomen. But
Right.
they know who's in charge. And by trying to break you, they're trying to make you an example to anyone else at the Charleston plant. Well, look what happened to John Barnett. You better shut up. But I'll tell you, if Boeing has to experience one or two more crashes due to Boeing faulty inspection or Boeing negligent design, it's going to break Boeing, because it's no longer just two major companies, Airbus and Boeing, dominating the world. You've got now the Chinese, Brazilian, Japanese about ready to offer competitive large-size passenger planes, number one. And number two, you may not know this, John, but in the 1950s, the British aerospace industry was one of the leaders in the world, and they produced a plane called the Comet Jet, and 3 of them crashed.
Yes, sir.
And that was the end of the British aerospace industry leadership in the world. And so beware, Boeing, the board of directors of Boeing and the CEO digging in their heels on this Dreamliner mess and the disasters with the MAX have now a career conflict of interest with the future well-being of Boeing and its workers, which is why the families have demanded that there be a mass resignation, as would have happened, by the way, in Japan right away. They would have bowed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they would have bowed and resigned. David, Steve, any final comments or questions?
If I could just touch on one thing. You
talk
about the congressional hearing, and unfortunately I'm in the process of moving, and I was able to get bits and pieces of it. And I guess my put is, I'd love to sit down with the CEO and the decision makers at Boeing and let them take my concerns seriously, and let's have a one-on-one discussion. I don't have a problem talking to any of them.
John, we're demanding that the committees have technical specialists testify after Boeing and not let Boeing get away with its stonewalling.
That's excellent. That's an excellent plan. Yes, sir.
And you will testify, I assume.
Absolutely. But one of the things I've noticed Dennis Muhlenberg keeps saying over and over is, safety and quality is top priority. Well, as a quality manager, I have I don't know if you're familiar with performance management reviews, but it's a yearly review where you sit down with your boss and they review your work over the year and they grade you on how well you did. And based on those reviews, it defines your future raises, your bonuses, your ability to participate in special leadership programs, that type of thing. During my performance review as a quality manager, I was penalized and basically received no raises. And he actually put this in writing, that I needed to learn to work in the gray areas of the procedures, that I was knowledgeable almost to a fault, that I needed to stop documenting quality issues and defects in email. So my question to Dennis is, you're sitting up here saying that safety and quality is top priority, but yet you have quality managers within your organization that are being penalized for following processes. So how does that make it top priority?
Which is exactly why you should testify before Congress.
I'm willing anytime, Ralph. I mean, like I say, they've done their damage to me. I was forced to retire, and I will deal with what's ahead of me. but it really needs to be brought to light before we start losing the airplanes.
Steve,
And that's
David?
my top concern, is the safety of the flying public. As a quality manager, that's what I swore to protect, and I'm going to do everything I can to.
And you put your entire career on the line.
Yes, sir, I did. I was put in a position to where I had to choose between the company I love and the job I love and my career versus the safety of the flying public. And I had to sacrifice those to protect the flying public, or at least try to.
Beautifully said. Steve and David?
Well, I certainly don't know how to top that. I'm kind of speechless, sir, at your courage, and completely appalled at the arrogance of Boeing. And boy, it just makes you want to have that whole company just crash.
There's some serious reckoning that needs to happen in there, as far as following procedures and building the airplane correctly. It's for sure something needs to change before it's too late.
And Boeing is in trouble with their defense contracts, with NASA contracts. The contractors in NASA and Boeing in the Pentagon are fed up. They've often suspended the contracts. They've berated Boeing. So Boeing has a multifaceted management problem of great serious proportion.
Yes, sir. You're correct. And I'm sure y'all heard about the KC-46 the Air Force refused to take because they were finding so much FOD and debris. That was just recently.
That's right.
Where are the Pilots Association, the stewardesses, and all this?
Well, see, that's the thing, is all of this is internal to Boeing. So, as an example, the slivers that I found in the 25% failure rate of the emergency oxygen system, Boeing does not notify the customers that that's an issue. So they keep it under wraps internal to Boeing and try to cover it up or, make it go away. So the pilots, the stewardesses, the customers don't know any of that.
Well, we're out of time, John M. Barnett, and congratulations congratulations on your Joe A. Calloway Award for Civic Courage. I'm sure you'll get other awards too. We hope to see you before Congress to react to Boeing's testimony, and full speed ahead for you in the coming months and years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nader, and it's a pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to meeting you very soon.
Certainly.
We have been speaking with John M. Barnett, whistleblower and winner of the Joe A. Calloway Award for Civic Courage. For more about his story, go to ralphnaderradiohour.com. Right now, we're going to take a short break and check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. When we come back, Ralph has his own update about Boeing, and we'll answer more of your questions. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back after this.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, November 15, 2019. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A Massachusetts Buffalo Wild Wings is under investigation after a chemical mixture inside the kitchen killed one employee and left at least 10 staff members and customers hospitalized. According to Boston's WHDH-TV, the fire department responded to the restaurant chain in the town of Burlington, Massachusetts, just after 5:30 p.m. A team of firefighters wearing hazmat suits found a male worker suffering from nausea. The fire chief said at a news conference that the man had been exposed to the chemical, which was being used to clean the floor, after another individual mixed it and became ill. The man was rushed to a hospital where he later died. Authorities said that at the time he inhaled the fumes, he was trying to save others from the chemical. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. We're going to take your listener questions, but first, Ralph, you have some update on the Boeing MAX 8 situation. Why don't you tell our listeners what's going on there?
Well, Boeing, the FAA, and their friends in Congress are racing to unground these 737-800 MAX by January or February. Now, there aren't that many of them. There'll be in the U.S. about 70, 80 of them immediately, and you should not fly them. And when you make a reservation, just ask the operator, what's the equipment? That's the technical term. And if they say it's a 737-800 MAX, say, I'd like to fly in another airline. And the airlines are willing to go along with this for the time being without charging you a reservation fee change like Delta does, $200. The second point I want to make is that it's really pretty insidious what's going on. Boeing is known from the beginning, it has the country by the throat. It's the only domestic manufacturer of all these big passenger jets. It gives money to over 300 members of Congress, campaign cash. and it knows how to throw its influence around and to turn the FAA into putty instead of a regulator. And so when David Calhoun, who's the chairman of the board of Boeing, he's been on the board since 2009. He has a full-time job with the Blackstone financial giant, says on CNBC a few days ago, quote, "From the vantage point of our board, Dennis Muhlenberg has done everything right. Remember, Dennis didn't create this problem. From the beginning, he knew that MCAS, that's the software fix, so-called, that boomeranged and led to two disastrous Boeing 737 MAX crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia with 346 fatalities. He says, from the beginning, he knew the MCAS could and should have been done better, and he's led a program to rewrite MCAS to alleviate all these conditions that ultimately beset two unfortunate crews and the families and the victims," end quote. That's completely false. Dennis Muhlenberg was in on this problem from the beginning. He represented the Boeing marketeers, overruling the Boeing engineers to get the MAX up as fast as possible to compete with Airbus's 320 Neo. He's been CEO well before the Boeing MAX took off. He was in at the founding. And for his rubber stamp, David Calhoun, the chairman of the board of directors, to say he didn't create the problem is totally false. But you see, that's what's going on. The fix is in. The Congress is not going to do much. They have resisted our demands that they have a panel for the consumer groups like flyersrights.org. You should go to it for updates, and Consumers Union, and people like myself who's written on aviation safety. They haven't announced a hearing on that. They haven't announced a hearing for the second round for the labor unions who have to deal with these planes every day. They haven't announced, most crucially, a hearing for the technical critics, the aerospace experts, the avionics, the aerodynamic experts who are beseeching to testify and take apart Boeing's nonsense before the congressional committees. And they haven't allowed the families, who are now very, very knowledgeable about what's going on. They've met with all kinds of technicians, the FAA, the National Transportation Safety Board. They haven't been scheduled for a hearing either in the House under Congressman DeFazio from Oregon or in the Senate, Senator Wicker from Mississippi. So, folks, it's going to be a very touch and go situation in the next few weeks until the early part of 2020. Weigh in on your member of Congress. They can say, slow down, Boeing. Don't you dare certify FAA. And we'll have more time to get this thing in better shape. Flyersrights.org is your update for any questions you may have.
Well, I have a question, Ralph. Were you at the hearing where Muhlenberg apologized to the families a few weeks ago?
Yes, I was at the hearing. Muhlenberg apologized more than once. He was told by my niece, Nadia Milleron, after the hearing, that when he apologizes, he should look the families in the eye and not do it when he's looking straight ahead at the members of the House committee, at which point he did that. He did that again. But he was raked over the coals because he was slated for a bonus of $15 million. Can you imagine? And he's dropped that. He's no longer taking that. And he's now making $23 million a year, and he was taken to task by some members of the House committee on that. But what they didn't do is break it down. At the end of the hearing, they said, Mr. Muhlenberg, you have now made $75,000 since you walked in this room at 9:30 and left at 3:30.
So in spite of all of that, your feeling is that Congress will ultimately not call them to task in a serious way.
Unless there's a new surge of air traveler demands, because they are afraid that the air travelers will start gumming up the works by saying we're not going to fly the MAX. The airlines will be perplexed on how to handle this. The Boeing MAX brand will be seriously tarnished. And so what they're worried about are the air travelers and the labor unions, and above all, the families of the bereaved who are really, really organized and are getting all kinds of access to the FAA, to the Department of Transportation, to the House, to the Senate. And they even spent a couple hours with Dennis Muhlenberg, the CEO of Boeing. So if all these things come together, what will we get? We will get the publicity of the way Boeing is supposedly going to fix this plane that they've sent in secret to the FAA. We'll get that out in the open. We'll let the technical critics go over it, have a 60-day comment period, and then we'll see where we're at. And at the same time, Congress should have the hearings I just mentioned with the labor unions, the families, the consumer groups, and the aerospace experts, some of whom worked for Boeing, others are subject matter specialists. And do they have a story to tell?
So, Ralph, in one kind of simple sentence, what is your demand, or what are the demands of the family here that they want from Boeing? Do they want it completely grounded, build a new plane? Well, is there some other solution?
The Boeing 737-800 MAX is a new plane. It should have been subject to a full certification. That's what they're demanding. That would include analyzing the aerodynamic instability problem, as well as the faulty, complicated software fix they call the MCAS. Full certification, and if the plane is ever slated to be ungrounded, full simulator training, as Senator Captain Sullenberger testified for the House in June, should be required of the pilots by the airlines and Boeing's. Full certification, full simulator training before that plane is up.
In your opinion, knowing a lot about, avionics, do you think this plane would pass the certification?
Well, it depends on how stringent the FAA is. They can pass anything. They've been pretty permissive with Boeing. But
because they allowed Boeing to basically certify it themselves.
That's right. And they weren't up to date on the software fix. They weren't even informed by Boeing that the software strength was increased fourfold. And Boeing didn't even notify the airlines or the pilots that this stealth hijacker, this software could take the control of the plane away from the pilots and nosedive it into the Java Sea or into a farmer's area in Ethiopia at 550 miles per hour, killing 346 people.
Now, does the FAA have the expertise and the staff to be able to do this? Because I thought that was the excuse before, and that's why they allowed Boeing to do it.
Yes, they didn't have adequate staff, but they have adequate resources to hire consultants and people who can immediately come to grips with this even more profoundly than what FAA staff can do.
You would think they could have maybe an independent blue ribbon panel like what happened after the Challenger disaster, the space shuttle disaster.
Well, they've had these panels, Steve, but the problem is they're all looking backward properly as to what happened, who knew what when, who covered up, who didn't inform, who didn't respond. Now the panels have to address the question, should this plane ever fly again? And if it does, under what conditions? And that looking forward panels have not been brought together because they don't want to experience the conclusion of some of the findings, which is that unless that airframe and the engine overload problem that leads to the prone to stall inclination by the 737 MAX is addressed, the plane should never fly, and they're not willing to burden Boeing with that kind of economic price. So it all comes down to Boeing cash, Boeing profits.
And for the victims to be satisfied, it's going to take a movement and publicity and flyers knowing about these problems and potentially not flying on this plane for them to get their attention.
Yeah, and the coordinator is Flyers Rights, run by Paul Hudson, who lost his daughter at 16 years old in the Lockerbie collision over Scotland 30 years ago. Go to flyersrights.org. He'll say exactly what he thinks you can do vis-a-vis Congress and elsewhere. We are passing out buttons, Axe the Max, for people to wear, take a picture, put it up on the internet. What Boeing can't control is a growing consumer boycott. Calls to airlines, even if you're not flying, just say, we don't want you to use this plane. Boeing cannot control that. They can control the political situation in Washington. They can hammer the airlines and say you got no choice, but they can't control resistance by the bread and butter of the airlines, the air traveler.
All right. Well, you heard it, listeners. Flyers Rights is your source of updates and information, and it really could be a consumer movement that decides the fate of the Boeing MAX 8. So let's move to some listener questions now. David?
This is from Paul G. Warwick, Ralph. He says, I live in a Trump supporter region. If you talk to one Trump supporter, you talk to them all. The problem, as I see it, they are fed daily propaganda, mostly by Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, etc. I would like to know, who are the big money players supporting this subverted, often toxic media? If you control the people, you control the politicians, right? Shouldn't journalists seek out these big money players and interview them on their positions on policies and issues? Politicians are puppets. Why waste time on them when there are deeper sources we should focus on? Make them answer for their manipulations of our government and media. Out them. Yes.
All right. The big money players, first of all, are the advertisers on Fox and Rush Limbaugh. And you can just get their name by listening to their ads. They're usually the big companies, General Motors and the Merck drug companies, Bank of America, you name it. So they're the ones. Without advertising, no Fox News, no Rush Limbaugh, and no Facebook, and no Google. So there are consumer groups who focus on the advertisers. They threaten boycotts, they announce boycotts, they go after the brand, and they're making some progress in that way. You'll notice that when there's misbehavior by a certain talk show on television and they start losing ads, that person has either lost his or her job, or they tend to reconsider how far they're going to go with their blathering.
All right. This next question comes from a longtime listener and frequent questioner. Usually asks very good questions, Earl Ammerman IV. And he says, why is Joe Biden ignoring the fact that in order to accomplish his moonshot to cure cancer, there needs to be healthcare infrastructure, such as paid sick leave, in order to make the moonshot to cancer work for actual cancer patients who can't afford to miss work because they lack paid sick leave and might lose their house and job if they are hospitalized. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the moonshot to cure cancer seems to be an Orwellian policy that seems to benefit drug companies by subsidizing their research and development, while cancer patients get the short end of the stick because they won't benefit because the $100,000 chemo pills would be too expensive, and cancer is not like the common cold. You don't just kick it after a couple of days. Cancer patients miss work to seek treatment. If they don't have paid sick leave, they won't be able to keep a roof over their head due to how expensive cancer treatment is.
Well, a lot of what you say, Earl, is correct. If the moonshot actually produces policies to prevent cancer, then I think part of your legitimate complaints are avoided, because people will not get cancer. They won't have to deal with unpaid sick leave, et cetera, et cetera. But these big moonshot programs do increase the profits enormously of the companies that are in the arena to make money from cancer treatment or all the other aspects that cancer patients need. And that's where the profiteering comes in. And you know, as well as others, that these companies are going to try to get the lion's share of that taxpayer bonanza as they see it. And by the way, we're one of the few countries in the world that call themselves democracies that don't have paid sick leave.
This last question is not really a question. I just wanted to share it with our listeners and with you on the air, Ralph. It comes from Manal Hamza, and I don't know if that's a he or she actually, but it says, Dear Ralph, I wanted you to know that my father, Dr. Zayed Hamza, has been listening to your Radio Hour podcast lately. Today, his weekly column in the daily Al Rai Amman Jordan starts with you and the interview you had with Stephen Greenhouse when we talked about unions. And he says, your impact and reach are critical locally and globally. Thank you, Manal. I just wanted to share that with you and get a reaction.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Manal. It's really good. We've had feedback from places all over the world, and that's one of the benefits of the new technology. Can carry a program everywhere. And I'm glad that some of the interviews we have relevance to conditions and issues of justice in these lands around the world.
Thank you for your questions. Keep them coming on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website. Now, Ralph and David, before we go, I just want to take a few moments to alert our listeners that we're going to be releasing a special Ralph Nader Radio Hour on the impeachment of Donald J. Trump. It's going to be in the form of a series of podcasts and will feature Ralph and our resident constitutional scholar, Bruce Fine. As regular listeners know, Bruce Fine is no radical lefty. He is a Republican who has worked in the Reagan administration as well as for conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute. As a young lawyer, he was even in the Justice Department during the impeachment inquiry of Richard Nixon. He also worked with the Republican floor manager, Bob Barr, not Bill Barr, Bob Barr, different guy. He worked with Congressman Bob Barr from Georgia on the impeachment of Bill Clinton about 20 years ago. Bruce is a real stickler for the Constitution, and he's written extensively about that founding document and how we as a country have strayed from many of its core articles. So this series of podcasts is an effort to take you beyond the politics of the moment, as perilous as these times are, and offer to our listeners, as well as those in Congress, a constitutional reset of sorts. Bruce has outlined 14 impeachable offenses that could be leveled at this president. Most are exclusively particular to Donald Trump, but there are others of which could be leveled at the past half dozen presidents as well. Each episode will dive into each count in the indictment, so to speak. So look for this series of podcasts on our website, our YouTube channel, Instagram, Twitter, and any other platform from which you download the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. So look for our special report on the impeachment of Donald J. Trump. I want to thank our guests again, John M. Barnett. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel, and for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And Ralph has got 2 new books out, The Fable, How the Rats Reformed the Congress. To acquire a copy of that, go to ratsreformcongress.org. And To the Ramparts, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump Presidency and Why It Isn't Too Late to Reverse Course. We will link to that also.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we speak to legendary FCC Commissioner Nicholas Johnson. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Stay alert.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up, where Ralph weighs in on the question of Bernie Sanders versus Elizabeth Warren.
This was from Stephen Gonzalez, and the subject is Sanders versus Warren. And he says, Dear Ralph, can you talk about the difference between the two candidates? The most I've heard from you is regarding their use of rhetoric, language about structural change versus political revolution. Can you also talk about each candidate's support for Medicare for All, their lifelong political commitments, the comprehensiveness of their environmental plans? Are you concerned that Warren, while pledging not to take corporate money in the general election, has said she would raise corporate money for the DNC, the Democratic National Committee? Should we be concerned that she does not yet have a plan for how we pay for Medicare for All? Although, actually, she has come out with a plan since this question was submitted. Can you talk about each candidate's representation in the media? Ultimately, which candidate do you think is better?
Well, Elizabeth Warren supports a better bill, the one in the House of Representatives supported by 140 Democrats so far, a majority of the Democrats in the House. Bernie has a less better bill in the Senate. And so the answer to the question is, as of now, Elizabeth's support of the House bill is better than Bernie's support of his own bill in the Senate. The second is taking corporate money. If she becomes the nominee, she has to make peace with the Democratic National Committee and all the committees in all the states. You can't fight your own party. And it's up to her to prove that she can raise adequate money online, just the way Bernie Sanders did when he almost won the nomination, except for the dirty tricks by the Hillary crowd in 2016 and the DNC, which was for Hillary. So I wouldn't rush to judgment if I was Elizabeth Warren. She may raise over $1 billion just online in small denominations, $27, $30 average. Ultimately, which candidate do you think is better? It's hard to project how they would operate under pressure. Let's face it, they're the best two candidates the Democrats have put forth in many years, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. But if they're in the White House and they're surrounded by corporations and corporate indentured politicians on the Hill, they're going to rely on you, people. And if you don't organize, demonstrate, march, buttonhole your senators, representatives, throw them out of office if they don't shape up, what do you expect them to do in the White House when they can come forward and there's nobody behind them to support them? And the corporates is saying to Bernie or Elizabeth, if you do this on healthcare, the stock market will crash. You do this on taxing Wall Street, which is undertaxed, and the stock market will crash. And that means that the pension funds will be worth less. Don't think you're ever going to get a president of buying for the people without the people organizing. Doesn't mean tens of millions, just means a few million spread throughout congressional districts. You control Congress, you can give big backing to Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders should they win the presidency.
Warren did outline how she would pay for Medicare for all, and it's different than what Bernie is saying, because Bernie has been upfront and saying, yeah, your taxes are going to rise, but that will be completely offset by what you'll save on the other end through premiums and deductibles and copays and all those other things. Strategically, though, it seems like a lot of those things that Bernie is talking about that are offsetting the higher taxes are generally hidden from people, because it has to do with, what the companies are paying and all of that. It's not such a direct benefit that people actually see. So strategically, do you think Warren has got a better plan, or do you think Bernie just being straightforward and saying all of these things will be more than offset by the taxes that will be erased?
I think both of them have the wrong approach to explain full Medicare for all, everybody in, nobody out, free choice of doctor and hospital, better outcomes, far less mortality due to the lack of health insurance, which doesn't exist in Canada because they have health insurance for everybody. The way you start, Steve, is not with a complicated set of tax increases here and there, which is befuddling even supporters of Elizabeth Warren, or a more vague approach, which is accurate by Bernie, that you will save more by not having to pay premiums out of pocket than the increased taxes, which will be mostly on the wealthy and the Wall Street transaction tax and so on. You start this way. Canada has had, since the late 1960s, a full Medicare for all. People have one card in their pocket. They get sick, they go, they show the card, they don't even see a bill. When you're sick in Canada, you go see a doctor or go to a hospital. They ask, what's your problem? In the US, they ask, what's your insurance? So you start with the following. If Canada can cover everybody at $5,000 or less per capita per year on the average, and we don't cover everybody and still pay $10,000 per capita on the average, leaving 30 million without coverage and 50 million under coverage, that means that we can cut our expenses in half easily. So we start out with, how are you going to pay for full Medicare for all? Simple. We've got a system that's going to cut the expenses in half to begin with. The rest is a piece of cake. We'll just increase the tax to where it was under the Eisenhower years on the wealthy, increase the taxes, which are not taxed now on Wall Street transactions, have increased in some of the sin taxes, and we'll have plenty. They ought to start with that per capita average, because what Warren and Bernie are going to be trapped by is a huge corporate dominated, bloated, greedy, profiteering, pricing drugs and hospital days like crazy. And you can't control that with a single payer unless you address the cost reductions. And that's what they haven't paid enough attention to. The bills are so complicated that they've produced $350 billion in fraud in the U.S. every year, according to The expert on this, we mentioned many times, Malcolm Sparrow at Harvard University, and another study by Congress in the early 90s. Now, you don't see that in Canada because it's a single payer. You don't have 1,500 insurance companies, all kinds of intermediaries, unbundled, very complex, inscrutable billings that people are floored by. You don't see that. They don't talk about that. You see what I mean? You start with, this is an immensely less expensive healthcare system. 5,000 compared to over 10,000. 5,000 covers everybody. The 10,000 leaves tens of millions out. That's how you start. Once you cut it down to the Canadian level, and the Canadians love their system, then you can talk about how to pay for it. But if you start with the bloated system that's going to blow any Medicare for all system sky high if it doesn't control drug prices, if it doesn't provide budgets for hospitals, et cetera, it's never going to work. The corporate greed will destroy it on the installment plan. I agree, there's a transition period of probably 4 years where you have to ease out of the present corrupt, bloated system and ease in. But I don't recall anybody who had a health insurance plan privately funded in the early 1960s get upset when Medicare came in for the elderly. They didn't say, oh, you're going to take my private plan away, says a 72-year-old woman or a 69-year-old man. No, they just picked up the Medicare card, and the company didn't have to insure them on their insurance plan. The hidden ally here is the corporations would love to get rid of having to insure their employees.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
But, that appeal is not made by Bernie and Elizabeth enough. General Motors is spending more on healthcare than on steel and rubber combined.
Right.
Wow.
Now, they will be given a tax, but it won't be as much as they're paying now. And then there are all the headaches of administrating it that corporate executives are tired of, that they'll be relieved of. So that's why we want citizen leaders in the healthcare business to have congressional hearings where they can testify.
Well, the headline for me that I think relates to people's the thing you said about when you get sick in Canada, they ask you, what's your problem? When you get sick in America, they ask you, what's your insurance? I think
And that is your
can relate to
problem.
that.
Your problem is your insurance.
Then that ends up being your problem, yes. But that simple little meme, put on a T-shirt, put on buttons, I think people will understand it, because I am amazed at how people in my circle, college-educated people, we're the so-called intellectual elite, they don't even understand what system we're talking about. They don't know the difference between the English system, which is total nationalization, versus the Canadian system, which is what we talked about, privately delivered, national health insurance.
Public insurance, private delivery, free choice of doctor and hospital, no matter how little you earn or how lot you earn. It's very egalitarian.
But people do not understand that. And I think you've probably hit on something, that both Sanders and Warren are not boiling it down to those simple things.
Let me just put it this way. I put out a pamphlet called 25 Ways Life is Better in Canada in the U.S. because they have full Medicare for all. It's on the website, singlepayeraction.org. You can download it and print 1 million copies if you'd like. Singlepayeraction.org. Those are the arguments that Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and others down at the local and state level running for election next year should be making. And also, it comes down, Steve and David, to the absence of anxiety, dread, and fear every day that operates in this country and does not prevail in Canada. There's nobody in Canada who dies because they can't afford health insurance to get diagnosed and treated in time. About 40,000 people, 800 or so a week, die in the U.S. because they cannot afford health insurance to get diagnosed and treated in time. And hundreds of thousands of people with injuries and illnesses continue to have them because they can't afford diagnosis and treatment in time. And tens of millions fear that same possibility. Anxiety, dread, fear. That's something everybody understands in the USA. It's lost in the welter of how you're going to pay for it and Bernie and Elizabeth are thrown on the defensive. I mean, this guy, Peter Buttigieg, he's throwing Bernie and Elizabeth on the defensive. He doesn't have a plan worth talking about. The mayor of South Bend.
Right.
And
or Nancy Pelosi, who's doing the same thing.
Because they don't start with, how come the Canadians, who aren't any smarter than we are, cover everybody for $5,000 or less average per capita, and we can't cover tens of millions, and the charge here already is over $10,000 per capita.
But they'll say, listen, Canada is smaller, it's not as diverse, you really can't scale it up here. What would you say to that?
What are you talking about? Canada has a lot of minorities. They have a population that looks like us. And when a patient goes for surgery in Canada and 10 patients go for the same surgery in the US, you just develop the proportion. The key is, what is the one person paying per capita and what is the 10 people individually paying per capita? Of course, it's going to cost more in a macro sense in the US because we're 10 times the population. But the real fact is, what does it cost on the average per capita? In Canada, free choice of doctor and hospital. You don't really see a bill. No anxiety, dread, and fear. Lives saved, injuries dealt with, illnesses treated, and they do it on half the price. And we can't even do it on double the price. And we cover only about 80% of the people or so. And the rest are left to fester and to be ridden with fear, anxiety, and dread. So the fact that they're a smaller country doesn't mean that. They use the same technologies, MRIs, pharmaceuticals. They just don't let these companies get away with skyrocketing gouging, price gouging. You go to have an MRI in Toronto, you don't pay anywhere near what they pay in Buffalo. Same machine, produced by the same manufacturer.
Well, here's another question I hear a lot. What about doctors? Will doctors get paid less, and will that cause a shortage of doctors and nurses?
Doctors will get paid less. You won't see a doctor in Canada making $2-3 million as a cardiovascular surgeon or an anesthesiologist making $1 million. I think the top amount that doctors in Canada make are about $400,000 to $500,000. But they're able to practice medicine. They don't have to deal with bills, denials of treatment that they want to apply to their patient by health insurance operative miles away. Constant conflict, having to hire a secretary full-time for every doctor just to deal with the paperwork. So they do make less on the average, but they do the work they love.
And they also don't have the bills that they have to pay for their education, which makes them go into
debt,
high-paying specialties because they're in debt.
Correct.
Because we do have a shortage of general practitioners, do we not?
Yes, and medical school debt is a factor. They go into the specialties to make more money. So we should learn from A to Z from Canada. No, they have problems in Canada. No system is perfect, but compared to what we're having in this country, it's amazing. We don't have 1 million people every week rallying somewhere in the country to get what the Canadians have. I've asked some Canadians to hire buses, fill them with Canadians who've experienced the healthcare system, and drive throughout the U.S. to disabuse Americans of the corporate propaganda that they've been subjected to.
Rand Paul got his hernia surgery in Canada, Mr. Libertarian.
For a third of the price he would have had to pay in Texas. And he got 4 days in a hospital with 3 meals a day and checkups to make sure there was no infection coming as a result of the surgery. He was very satisfied, but he still doesn't want single payer.
If we have time, can we just circle back to tactics? Because as you've pointed out, corporations love socialism when it's for them. Obama went to the pharmaceutical industry and the health insurance lobbyists to pre-clear Obamacare. Tactically speaking, if a President Sanders or President Warren gathered all the corporate titans into the Oval Office, except Aetna, the people from Blue Cross, Anthem, and said, I want to give you a bailout here. Get behind this. What would their response be? Does the president have that much power to jawbone the industrialists into accepting what is essentially, socialized health insurance?
Well, I don't think they have to be jawboned. I think corporations are sick and tired of the time, detail, conflict, wrangling with health insurance companies that the company is paying along with a copay to cover their workers. I think they would love to be relieved of that burden, and they should be natural allies of any president that wants a single payer system. When Jack Smith was president of GM Canada, and he was promoted to become president of GM International in Detroit, he was asked about the Canadian healthcare system. He said it worked pretty good when I was up there, but he didn't want to say that's what we should have down here south of the border from Canada, because he didn't want to engage in a tremendous battle with the powerful health insurance companies. But in his mind, he would love the Canadian system. So would the head of U.S. Steel. So would the head of Kennecott Copper. So I might add with the head of Pfizer, because under single payer, you replace the private health insurance industry. You don't replace the drug industry. You don't replace the hospital industry. But they are given budgets. They are given price restraints. I just read there's a new drug out to deal with melanoma, carcinogenic melanoma, $250,000 per patient for 1 year. Now, let me test both of you. I'm going to ask you, what do you think of when you just heard what I said? What's your reaction?
I wish I did studied math in high school.
I want to see what your reaction is, Steve.
The price of this, $250,000, you said?
1 year per patient.
I mean, well, it means I'm dying if I have this, because I don't have that.
Yeah.
Even I don't have that, and I'm very well off.
It's a pay or die situation in the U.S., which is pretty cruel, why we let them get away with it. But you know what the interesting response would be?
What?
Why don't you break down the $250,000? I want to see all the constituent costs by that company that led him to price it at $250,000, deducting all the federally sponsored research from the National Institutes of Health that they got free, paid by the taxpayer. No one ever in Congress, even the ones that denounce these $300,000 a year per patient per year, they don't say, break it up, break it down. I want to see every little cost item that you added up to charge a patient $250,000 for 1 year. You see how inept the counterattack is by humanity?
And because it's not connected to that, it's connected to supply and demand, and they've got supply, and there's a demand with high stakes.
With all the money the drug companies are making, there are now shortages of key drugs. Why are there shortages of key drugs? Because the federal government is not doing its job. They're allowing unbelievable profits, and then they're allowing imports from China and India, and maybe the supply chain is screwed up, and you got patients in hospitals that don't have crucial drugs, and the government doesn't do anything about it. That's why the people have to take over.
Do you challenge your bill? Do you go over it line by line?
Who are you asking, Steve?
I'm asking Ralph. When you get a bill, do you, from a doctor, do you?
Yeah. But the line by line comes when you're in the hospital. I mean, you just go to a foot doctor or something, you get a simple bill, one line. It's if you have a more complicated procedure where every specialty puts an item in the bill and you can't figure it out, it's code, Medicare code or whatever.
And they don't tell you what it's going to cost.
You cannot go through it. It's impossible for you to go through it. It's like decoding ancient Greek.
But don't we have a right to say, wait a second, you're charging me $500 for an aspirin? I didn't agree to this. Or did I agree to this?
Yeah, you can challenge that. That you can detect, because even if you don't know the code, if they specify, like they were charging 20 years ago in a code blue section of a hospital in California, $8 for shaving a patient. Just simple shaving the patient. So you could say, where's that? What they'll tell you is that you got to pay for the overhead, the depreciation, the equipment. I mean, it's just crazy what's going on. We don't have any sheriff on the beat. We don't have any federal cop on the corporate gouging crime beat. And whose fault is that? Of course, it's the people. You start with the government not doing its job. You start with the corporations gouging you. You start with your Congress not representing you. So you get no, 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 right? So people of America, what's your final answer? The final answer is we got to get off our duff and organize in every congressional district, take control of Congress, clean up the elections, corruption, public financing of public campaigns, and with that massive crowbar, begin turning the country around. So it's an economy of, by, and for the people, not just the government of, by, and for the people. And we can look our children and grandchildren in the eye and not feel that we've betrayed them because we're too busy playing video games, watching TV, or making excuses for our own powerlessness, which we have cultivated.
And that's a wrap. Join us again next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too